Krambambuli by Marie von Ebnereschenbach. Translated by A.I. Dupont Coleman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A man may have a kind of liking for all sorts of things and all manner of creatures, but love, the real thing that does not pass away, he learns to know, if at all, only once in his life. This, at least, is the conviction of Ranger Hopp. How many dogs has he had in his time, and liked them too? But to love, what you can really call to love, and never to forget, only one, Krambambuli. He bought him, or more strictly speaking traded him, in the Lion Tavern at Wischau, from an under-forester out of a job. The very first time he looked at the dog he was taken with a liking for him that was to last as long as he lived. The master of the handsome beast, sitting at the table by an empty brandy glass and grumbling at the landlord because he would not give him another, looked like a thorough rascal. He was a little fellow, still young, and yet as dried up and weather-beaten as a dead tree, with yellow hair and a scanty yellow beard. His forester's coat, probably a relic of the departed splendors of his previous service, bore traces of a night spent in wet ditches by the roadside. Although Hopp was not fond of bad company, he took a seat near the fellow and began at once to talk with him. He soon found out that the good-for-nothing drunkard had already pledged his gun and his game bag to the landlord, and was now inclined to let the dog go the same way. But the landlord, red usurer, refused to hear of a pledge that would need to be fed every day. At first Herr Hopp said no word of the liking he had taken to the dog, but called for a bottle of the good Danzig cherry brandy which the landlord had, and made haste to pour some out for the vagabond. In an hour all was settled. The ranger handed over 12 bottles of the liquor on which the bargain had been struck, the other gave up the dog. To his credit be it said, it was not easy for him. His hands trembled so as he fastened the cord about the animal's neck that it seemed as if he would never finish the operation. Hopp waited patiently, admiring the wonderful quality of the dog in spite of his bad condition. He was not more than 2 years old. His coloring corresponded to that of the wretch who was abandoning him, though perhaps a couple of shades darker. On his forehead he had a mark, a white streak that ran off in slender lines to right and left, like pine needles. His eyes were big and black and lustrous, ringed about with clear amber. His ears sat high, long, and perfect. In fact, there was not a flaw in the whole dog, from the tips of his paws to the end of his fine, sensitive nose. The whole supple and yet powerful frame was beyond praise, borne on 4 living columns that might have supported the body of a deer and were not much thicker than a hare's legs. By St. Hubert, the creature must have had a pedigree as long and as pure as that of a knight of the Teutonic order. The ranger's heart exulted over the splendid bargain he had made. He stood up, took the cord which the vagabond had at last succeeded in tying, and asked, "What's his name?" "His name? Why, you can call him the same as what you have bought him for, Krambambuli." "Well, Krambambuli it shall be. Come on then. Are you ready? Off we go." But no matter how he called and whistled and pulled, the dog refused to obey. He turned his head toward the man whom he still regarded as his master, only whined when the latter shouted "March!" and accompanied the order with a vigorous kick, and still tried to huddle close to him. Only after a hard struggle did Herr Hopp succeed in taking possession of the dog. Finally he had to be tied up, put in a bag, and carried off on his new master's shoulder to the hunting lodge which lay several miles away. It took 2 full months before Krambambuli, beaten half to death and chained with a spiked collar after each attempt at flight, at last came to understand to whom he belonged. But then, when his subjection was completed, what a dog he was! No tongue can describe, no word can measure the height of perfection that he reached, not merely in the exercise of his appointed functions, but in his daily life as a zealous servant, a good comrade, a true friend and guardian. It is often said of intelligent dogs that nothing is lacking to them but the power of speech. To Krambambuli not even this was lacking. His master, at least, was able to hold long conversations with him. The ranger's wife became actually jealous of Buli, as she called him scornfully. Sometimes she reproached her husband. She had spent the whole day in silence at her monotonous knitting when she was not sweeping, washing, or cooking. At night, after supper, when she picked up her knitting again, she would have been glad of a bit of a chat. "You've always got something to say to Bully, Hop, and never anything to me. Talking to a dumb brute the way you do, you'll forget how to talk to humans." The ranger admitted that there was something in what she said, but he saw no remedy. What was he to talk to his old woman about? They had never had any children. They were not allowed to keep a cow, and a gamekeeper finds no interest in domestic fowls when they are alive, and not much when they are cooked. The breeding or shooting of game, on the other hand, she knew nothing about. Finally, Hop found a way out of the difficulty. Instead of talking to Krambambuli, he talked of Krambambuli, of the triumphs that he won everywhere, of the envy that the possession of him excited, of the absurdly high sums that had been offered for him and contemptuously rejected. 2 years passed by in this manner. Then one day the countess, his master's wife, appeared at the ranger's door. He knew at once what the visit must mean, and when the kind and beautiful lady began, "Tomorrow, my good Hop, is the count's birthday," he took up the sentence quietly with a smile. "And your gracious ladyship wishes to make him a present, and you have come to the conclusion that you couldn't give him anything else as good as Krambambuli." "Yes, yes, my dear Hop, you've guessed it." The countess flushed with pleasure at finding him meet her halfway, spoke of her gratitude, and begged him to name the price that should be paid for the dog. The wily old ranger chuckled, put on an exceedingly deferential air, and presently came out with a decisive declaration. "Please your ladyship, if the dog stays at the castle, if he doesn't bite through every cord and break every chain, or strangle himself trying, then your ladyship may have him for nothing, for that is just what he would be worth to me." The test was made, but it did not go as far as strangling, for the count, before that point was reached, lost all pleasure in the obstinate creature. It was useless to try to win him by kindness or to conquer him by force. He snapped at every one who came near him, refused to eat, and, for a hunting dog has not much reserve flesh, wasted away to a skeleton. In a few weeks Hop got word to come and take away his worthless cur. When he speedily responded to the summons and sought the dog in his kennel, there was a meeting full of indescribable joy. Krambambuli uttered a feeble bark, jumped on his master, put his forepaws against his breast, and licked away the tears of joy that were running down the old man's cheeks. On the evening of this blissful day the pair paid a visit to the tavern. The ranger played cards with the doctor and the steward. Krambambuli lay in the corner by his master's chair. Now and then Hop looked round at him, and the dog, no matter how sound asleep he seemed to be, instantly began to thump with his tail on the floor, as if he would say, "Here I am!" And when Hop, carried away by joy, shouted out as if it were a song of triumph, "How goes it with Krambambuli?" the dog rose with respectful dignity, stood at attention, and answered with his clear eyes, "It goes well." About this time, not only in the count's preserves, but in the whole surrounding district, a band of poachers carried on their operations in the boldest fashion. The leader was a dissolute rascal. He was called Yellow by the woodcutters who met him drinking his brandy in some tavern of ill repute, the gamekeepers who now and then got on his track, though they could never come up with him, and the customers whom he had for his ill-gotten booty among the lowest class in every village. He was the most daring rogue that ever set a problem for honest gamekeepers. He must have been at one time in the profession himself, or he would never have known how to track out the game with such accuracy or so cleverly to avoid every trap that was set for him. His depredations reached an unheard of height, and all the men employed on the estate were grimly bent on catching him. Thus it happened only too often that those who were caught in some small breach of the game laws were more roughly treated than at another time they would have been, or than could quite be justified. This caused a great deal of bitterness in various places. The head gamekeeper, against whom the feeling was strongest, received not a few well-meant warnings. The poachers, it was said, had taken their oath to make an example of him the first good chance they got. The bold, high-spirited man, however, tossed his warnings to the winds, and took all the more care to let it be known that he had enjoined the greatest strictness on his subordinates, and was prepared to take the entire responsibility for any unpleasant consequences. Most frequently he reminded Ranger Hop of the need for strict execution of his duties, and sometimes reproached him for lack of sharpness, at which, however, the old man only smiled. But Krambambuli, at whom on such occasions he looked down with a wink, yawned loudly and contemptuously. He and his master bore no grudge against the head gamekeeper, who was the son of the memorable hero that had taught Hopp all the noble lore of the chase, as Hopp in turn had initiated the gamekeeper when a boy into the same calling. The ranger still thought with pleasure of the trouble he had taken with his education, was proud of his former pupil, and loved him in spite of the rough handling which he, as well as the others, got from him. One June morning he met him again in the act of administering justice. It was in the circular clearing among the lime trees at the end of the park on the border of the Count's Wood, and in the neighborhood of the breeding places which the head gamekeeper would have liked to protect with murderous mines. The trees were at their best just then, and a dozen small boys had climbed into their branches. Nimble as squirrels, they swarmed over the limbs of the splendid trees, broke off all the smaller branches within their reach, and threw them on the ground. 2 women quickly picked them up and stuffed them into baskets, which were already more than half full of the fragrant spoils. The head gamekeeper flew into a terrible rage, and ordered his subordinates to shake the boys out of the trees, regardless of the height from which they fell. While he crawled to his feet, with cries and lamentations, one with the skin scratched off his face, another with a dislocated shoulder, a third with a broken leg, he gave the 2 women a sound drubbing with his own hands. In one of them Hopp recognized the light hussy whom rumor pointed out as the mistress of Yellow. And when the women's baskets and shawls and the boys' hats had been seized, and Hopp was charged to produce them before the court, he could not get rid of an unpleasant foreboding. The order which the head keeper, wild as a devil in hell and surrounded by wailing and tortured sinners, shouted to him then, was the last he ever had from him. 1 week later he came face to face with him again, in the circular clearing among the beech trees, dead. From the appearance of the body it was plain that it had been dragged here, through mud and underbrush, that it might lie in state on this very spot. It had been placed upon a pile of broken boughs, the forehead encircled with a chaplet of blossoms, and another wreath of the same sort laid across his breast. His hat was by his side, also filled with blossoms. The murderers had left him his game bag too, only they had removed the cartridges and replaced them with more blossoms. His fine breech loader was missing. In its stead was a worthless old musket. When later they found the bullet that caused his death buried in his breast, it fitted exactly the barrel of this weapon which had been laid in mockery across his shoulder. Hopp stood petrified with horror, gazing down at the disfigured corpse. He was unable to lift a finger, and even his brain seemed paralyzed. He could do nothing but stare and stare, and it was only some moments later that he regained his power of observation and asked himself a silent question: "What's the matter with the dog?" Krambambuli was sniffing at the corpse and running about distractedly, his nose on the ground. Once he whimpered, once he uttered a shrill yelp of joy, then he gave tongue and made a few quick leaps, just as if a long slumbering memory had awakened in him. "Down!" cried Hopp. "Down with you!" And Krambambuli obeyed. But he gazed at his master with intense excitement, and, as Hopp would have expressed it, said to him, "For goodness' sake, don't you see anything? Don't you smell anything? Oh, master dear, do look, do smell! Master, come this way!" And he thumped with his tail against the ranger's knee, stole back to the corpse, often looking round as if to say, "Do you follow me?" and began to take the heavy gun in his mouth, plainly trying to lift it. A shudder ran down the ranger's spine, and all kinds of conjectures began to dawn in his mind, but because it was his business not to see millstones, not to give instruction to the authorities, but rather to leave untouched the ghastly thing he had found, and go his way, which in this case led straight to the ministers of justice, well, he did just what it was his business to do. After all the formalities prescribed by the law in the case of such a catastrophe had been fulfilled, which took the whole day and part of the night, Hopp found time before he slept for another conversation with his dog. "Old dog," he said, "now the police are at work, and they'll be skirmishing about all over the place. Are we going to leave it to others to rid the world of the blackguard that killed the chief? My old dog knows the low-lived villain. Yes, he knows him. But nobody needs to know that. I haven't told them. Ha! I think I'll bring my dog into the job. There may be some sport." He stooped over the dog, who sat between his outspread legs, and pressed his cheek against the animal's head, taking his grateful caresses in return. Then he went on murmuring, "How goes it with my Krambambuli?" until sleep overtook him. Psychologists have attempted to explain the mysterious impulse that drives many criminals to return again and again to the scene of his crime. Hopp knew nothing of their learned disquisitions, but none the less he scouted incessantly with his dog in the neighborhood of the circular clearing. On the 10th day after the head keeper's murder he had for the first time given a few hours' thought to something else than his vengeance, and had been busy in the Count's wood, marking the trees which were to be taken down at the next cutting. When he had finished his task, however, he threw his gun over his shoulder once more and took the shortest way through the woods to the breeding places near the circle. At the particular moment when he set foot on the path that runs along the side of the beechwood, he fancied he heard something rustle in the underbrush. A moment later silence reigned again, a deep continuing silence. He would almost have thought there had been nothing to take note of, if the dog had not looked with such special keenness into the thicket. His hair bristling, his neck outstretched, his tail stiff, he glared at one particular spot in the undergrowth. "Oho!" thought Hopp. "If that's you, my fine fellow, just wait." He slipped behind a tree and cocked his gun. His heart beat wildly in his bosom, and his naturally short breath came near failing him entirely, when suddenly, wonderful to relate, Yellow came through the hedge onto the footpath. 2 young hares were hanging from his back, and on his shoulder the head-keeper's breech-loader with its Russia leather straps. It was a strong temptation to shoot down the villain from the safe concealment, but Hopp was not the man to fire upon even the worst offender without first warning him. With one bound he sprang out from behind the tree and onto the path, crying, "Give yourself up, you cursed rascal!" As the poacher, for his only answer, snatched the gun from his shoulder, the ranger pulled the trigger. Good heavens! A flash in the pan, a harmless crack instead of a heavy detonation. The loaded gun had been left too long leaning against the tree in the damp woods. "Good-bye, so this is death," thought the old man. But no, he is still unwounded. Only his head flies off, riddled with shot. The other, too, has no luck today. That is the last cartridge in his gun, and he must pull another out of his pocket. "At him!" cries Hopp hoarsely to his dog. "Seize him!" "Here, Krambambuli, here to me!" calls the other with a soft and coaxing voice. Ah, a well-known voice. And the dog? What happened next took less time to happen than to relate. Krambambuli had recognized his first master and ran towards him, half the way. Then Hopp whistled, and he turned. Yellow whistled, he turned again, quivering in desperate uncertainty on a spot equally distant from the 2 men, attracted at once and repelled. Finally the poor beast gave up the hopeless conflict and put an end to his doubts, but not to his suffering. Baying, howling, his belly on the ground, his body taut as a sinew, his head raised as though he were calling on heaven to witness his torture, he crawled to his first master. At the sight a thirst for blood seized Hopp. With trembling fingers he had put in a fresh cartridge. With calm sureness he took aim. But the poacher had once more raised his barrel to point it at him. This time it would be decisive. Both of them knew this, and, whatever thoughts were going through their minds, they faced each other as calmly as if they had been painted on canvas. 2 shots rang out. The keeper hit. The poacher missed. And why? Because, as the dog leaped upon him with excited caresses, he started at the moment of pulling the trigger. "Beast!" he hissed between his teeth, then fell backward, motionless. The executioner came slowly toward him. "You've had enough," he was thinking. "'Twere a pity to waste another bullet on you." Nevertheless, he set his gun on the ground and loaded it anew. The dog sat up straight in front of him, his tongue hanging out, panting quickly and loudly, and gazing at the ranger. And when he had finished his loading and picked up his gun once more, they held a colloquy of which no witness could have understood a word, had a living man been there instead of the dead. "You know for whom this bullet is meant?" "I can guess." "Deserter, traitor, vile scum, forgetful of all faith and duty." "Yes, master, that I am." "You were my joy once, but now it is all over. You are no more to me." "I know, master." And Krambambuli lay down, his head pressed close to his outstretched paws, and looked at the ranger. Yes, if the wretched brute had not looked at him, he might have made a quick end of it all, and saved himself and the dog further pain. But he could not. Who could shoot a creature that looked at him like that? Hopp muttered a few curses between his clenched teeth, each one more lurid than the last, bent over the poacher's body, took the hares, and went on his way. The dog followed him with his eyes until he had disappeared among the trees. Then he rose to his feet, and a blood-curdling howl rang through the woods. He ran round a few times in an aimless circle, and then sat down again by the dead man. In that position the officers of justice found him, when, led by Hopp, at nightfall they came to view the body and provide for its removal. Krambambuli drew back a few paces when the man approached. "There's your dog," said one of them to the ranger. "I left him here to watch," answered Hopp, ashamed to confess the truth. But it was no use, the truth came out just the same, for when the corpse was put on the cart and carried away, Krambambuli trotted after it, head and tail drooping. Next day a court attendant saw him slinking about near the room where the body of Yellow lay. The man gave him a kick and called out, "Go home!" Krambambuli snarled at him and ran away, as the man thought, in the direction of the ranger's house. He did not go there, though, but began to lead a miserable vagabond life. Wild and worn to a skeleton, he wandered about the poor dwellings of the cottagers at the end of the village. Suddenly he darted on a child that was standing in front of the last house, and snatched greedily from him the crust of bread that he was munching. The child was speechless with fright, but a small Spitz dog ran out of the house and barked at the robber. Krambambuli dropped his booty and fled. That same evening Hopp was standing at his window before going to bed, looking out into the bright summer night. In fancy he saw the dog sitting on the other side of the heath by the edge of the wood, gazing at the scene of his former happiness with unchanged longing, the truest of the true, masterless. The ranger closed the shutters and went to bed, but after a while he got up again, went once more to the window and looked out, but the dog was not there. Again he tried to sleep, and the second time it was in vain. He could bear it no longer. Whatever had passed, he could not get on without the dog. "I'll take him back," he thought to himself, and felt himself a new man after the decision. At the first peep of the day he dressed himself, told his wife not to wait dinner for him, and hastened away. But as he left the house he stumbled over the wanderer whom he had gone to seek afar off. Krambambuli lay dead at his feet, his head touching the threshold that he had not dared to cross. The ranger never got over it. Those were his best hours in which he forgot that he had lost him. Deep in affectionate thought he would murmur as of old, "How goes it with my Krambam?" But in the middle of the name he would stop suddenly, remembering, shake his head, and say with a heavy sigh, "Too bad about the old dog." End of Krambambuli by Marie von Ebnereschenbach. Read by Julie Niedermeyer.